Hi, my name is Dr. Rebecca Howard, and I am really excited to be here in my office at the invitation of the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History to talk to you about some Taneytown history. Thanks to these great 2020 times, I don't get to be there in person like I would have been initially. However, we do have a really cool opportunity to talk about this history and for me to bring you my research in a different medium, but one that hopefully can still communicate to you interesting and exciting information and gives us a moment to take a break and talk about the history of one of the more unique communities in the Ozarks, and that's Taneytown. So a little bit about me. I'm a history professor. I have written articles. I'm actually trained as a Civil War historian, but I've served on the board for the Taneytown Historical Museum, and I've found some really interesting sources about some of the early years of Taneytown and wanted to dig more into that. And so I've been able to do that, and I'm really excited to share with you some of the things that I've found. I am a native of Northwest Arkansas, but seventh generation Arkansan, I think, going back to Washington and Madison counties, the 1830s. I also, of course, have my own Taneytown connection, so some later arriving ancestors. I currently teach history at Lone Star College-Montgomery, just outside of Houston, Texas. And so I'm really doing some distance education with you guys today. So let me tell you a little bit about the setup here. I'm in my office at home, and I'm using a system that's going to let me switch back and forth between the camera that shows you my face and a view of the computer screen. So we'll do a PowerPoint as part of that, and then I've also got a map to show you. To kind of give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm looking at the history of Taneytown from the 1890s until the end of Prohibition. That's where I'm going to cut it off. That time period has some myths about it in some ways, or at least some stories that we've passed down that kind of evolved a bit, and they're not accurate in some ways, or we've forgotten some of that history for the community. And thanks to some newspaper research and some court cases, actually, a lawsuit that was filed by Felix Artemani in 1415, it shed some light on some of what they were doing to make money in Taneytown early on. That the story kind of skips from we're producing fruits for the market to we're producing grape juice with Welch's in the 1920s. But in there's more to it. And that's what I get to talk about today, thanks to finding that court case for Artemani and digging into some newspaper coverage of Taneytown that I hadn't seen before. So I'm excited to share that with you. Now here we're going to switch to one more thing. I am at home and I have dogs. One of them is sleeping right there. So if you hear barking, I'll try to pause it and let him calm down and then get restarted. So hopefully you won't even notice. Okay. We'll get to our PowerPoint presentation. Whoops. Hello, Mr. Father Bandini. Okay. So Taneytown was founded in Northwest Arkansas in the winter of 1897-98 by a group of Italians breaking away from an experiment in foreign settlement at Sunnyside Plantation in Chico County. And that was owned by Austin Corbin. Corbin was a New Hampshire-born robber baron. And this is a political cartoon from the 1890s. I believe they are buying up the federal government. These robber barons are, and you can see this is Corbin's face. So political cartoon, not super flattering to Corbin. He had, by the late 1890s, gained some national attention for his experiment at Sunnyside. And little of that was positive. A San Francisco newspaper observed, "If there is anything the United States do not need, it is immigration from Italy or anywhere else. This country has all the people it can take care of now, and a good many more than it is able to provide suitable employment. If Austin Corbin had a fancy for Italians, he could find them by the shipload right in New York." So his idea of let's bring Italian immigrants to rural areas to see if they assimilate better is clearly not being very well received nationally. However, he still goes along with it, goes through with it because he's Austin Corbin and he does what he wants. However, after his unexpected death in 1896, many of the Sunnyside Italians began to look for other opportunities. A leader of one of those groups was Father Peter Bandini. Now, Bandini had been a part of this experiment at Sunnyside with Corbin from the very beginning. And he really believed in this dream of let's bring Italians to places where they can be successful so they don't get stuck in tenements like they were in New York and where he saw them in New York when he was running a society there that was through the Catholic Church that was trying to help Italian immigrants. So he has this big dream, and the Italians who left Sunnyside with Bandini, and they moved from this corner of Arkansas down here up all the way up to the northwest corner of the state, so southeast to northwest. Those Italians that left the Sunnyside experiment with Bandini, they understood, they too were buying in, really, to Bandini's dream here. And it sets a tone for Taneytown as almost a self-conscious experiment. This community had very intense internal pressure to be successful and was also very aware of that outside perception that perhaps they weren't going to be able to be successful. So you can see this in Taneytown a lot, especially in the documents that we have from the early years. Bandini is constantly boosting the communities. He's spreading the word about it, and he's doing his very best to show that this is a place where immigrants are successful. And he's fighting against a national message that implies that immigrants are not, especially Italian immigrants, that they're lazy, that they aren't willing to work, or that they don't know how to be successful. You can tell that he's got that in the back of his mind. That criticism is in the back of his mind. And that gets internalized in Taneytown as well. And so a lot of the early sources for Taneytown that we have are pamphlets and newspaper articles and circulars and advertisements even that very much were people in Taneytown are putting their best foot forward and they're wanting to show they work hard, they're successful. This is the place to be if you want to be a successful immigrant, and they aren't going to fail. They aren't going to become dependent. So this sets up some interesting things for Taneytown. For the community, both oral history and published accounts of Taneytown usually state that the community initially invested in apple and strawberry production. And these are two promotional images that come from the community early on, where kids are posing in front of apple trees with big full baskets of apples. This is an image of, it's a cutout of a smaller image of a I swear this is Mimo Morsani, by the way. He's here eating strawberries. And so these are some of those images where they're trying to boost this story. Now, as a part of this early production of fruit products, the story goes that grapes were planted only as a symbol of the old country and for personal consumption. They weren't pursued for economic purposes. It was only when, the story goes, the San Jose scale decimated the apple trees that the community turned to grapes and ultimately in the late teens and early 20s pursued lucrative contracts with Welch's grape juice company in order to find a profitable cash crop. That story, however, is a little bit inaccurate. Grape production for commercial purposes was present in Taneytown from the very start. Not just for juice or table grapes, but really ultimately for the purpose of producing wine. This is an image from a document from a little newspaper. It's called L'Avvenire, which means the future, that was produced in Taneytown in 1906. And this shows an image of the Taneytown Wine and Fruit Distilling Company. So wine is in the name. And if you look at the dates on these barrels of wine, they say 1900, 1901. So it takes 3 years for grapevines to come into full production. So they had to have been planting these grapevines that are wine varieties. So different varieties of wine are grown for different reasons. Varieties that make a good wine aren't necessarily good to just eat or as tasty. And so we know from the names of the wines on these barrels that they're experimenting, first of all. Valpolicella here is referring to a grape variety that grows in northern Italy, which is not grown in Taneytown anymore. Cynthia here is probably Cynthiana, but Virginia grapes are another one that was developed for wine production. And so we know that based on the dates of these barrels that they had to have put these wine grapevines in the ground the very first summer that they arrived in Northwest Arkansas. So the first 20 years of grapes in Taneytown were actually about this wine production and fighting the inexorable encroachment of Prohibition. It was only after Prohibition and the arrival of the teetotaling Welches that Taneytown consciously started cultivating a drier image. The people of Taneytown, however, picked one of the worst times in American history to start a wine industry. By the time the Italians arrived, Arkansas already had a patchwork system of licensure, designated dry areas, and restrictions on production of alcohol. Dry areas were created by local or state acts that banned the sale of alcohol around specific buildings, usually schools and churches, but sometimes entire towns, for a defined distance. The University of Arkansas, for example, received a 3-mile halo of temperance in 1883. However, native wine production was treated differently from other intoxicating spirits, a fact that, according to Bandini later, had encouraged the Italians at Taneytown to pursue the craft. We have been induced to come to this section of the country, he stated, to practice our industry mainly by the existence of a law that was encouraging the production of grapes and protected the sale of native wine. Indeed, an act passed in 1899 exempted producers from licensure requirements if the wine was made from grapes grown in the state. This separate status also meant that any attempt to regulate the sale of native wine had to mention the spirit specifically. So all of this legislation that created these little dry areas could only ban the production of native wine if it was specifically mentioned. So if they only refer to intoxicating spirits, for example, it didn't ban native wines. By 1914, Taneytown had some 250 acres planted in grapes, reflecting a decade and a half of experimentation with various varieties. About 80% of the vines were Cynthiana grapes, according to a lawsuit filed by Felix Artemani, and the rest was made up of Ives, Concord, Delaware, and Catawba varieties. Only the Concord was known mostly as a table or a juice grape, meaning that it was good to eat. Cynthianas and the 3 other minor varieties were products of late 19th century experimentation up in the Midwest and Northeast. They were trying to find some grape varieties that would produce a wine that could compete with France. California would not emerge as a wine-producing region until the early 20th century. And they were also stunted by the Prohibition years too. Most of the grapes that Taneytown produced were made into wine, and not the sweet, high alcohol content fortified wines that most Arkansans associate with the early years of wine production in the South. Cynthianas produce a dry, deep red wine that resembled a Cabernet Sauvignon, but with spicier, earthier notes. So when you think of Taneytown wine now, most people think of post-Prohibition wines, and that's not what we're talking about here. This is a different type of wine. They were aiming for something like a Cabernet Sauvignon, something that was, or more like a French wine, and coming close to producing it. Wine production in Taneytown was also not just a hobby craft. Felix and Peter Artemani were the owners of one of the larger tracts of land put to grape cultivation, and they become members of the Arkansas State Horticultural Association in 1911, under which they started the Wine Growers Association. So I'm going to show you where their land was located. If I can get it to do what I want it to do. Okay, so this is a plat map, and if you go to page 87 in your copy of So Big This Little Place, you can look at it yourself. Let's see if I can delete that. Oh, well, I just made it all go away. Anyway, stop doing that. See, this is me and technology, y'all. Okay, so this space, this circle is around the intersection in the middle of Taneytown today. So this is Highway 412 right here. Here's the church and the land that's owned by the church today. This is the land that was owned by the Artemanis. And the Zuppo land was really, this is all vineyards here. The current Taneytown winery is right across the street from this Artemani land. So if you're sitting out on the front porch at the winery in Taneytown and you're looking out across the street, then that land would have been all vineyards in 1915. So that's where the Artemanis were growing most of their grapes. So they were not just doing this to sell locally. They were pushing this to be known nationally. And so we know this because in their lawsuit, when they're suing about a law that gets passed that's trying to put them out of business, it's creating this halo of temperance around Taneytown. They state that Taneytown wines in the first 20 years of the 20th century, Taneytown wines took premiums at county fairs across the state, including the Washington County Fair, won prizes at places as close as Hot Springs and as far away as the Chicago Exposition. Bandini talks about this as well. He said, Taneytown wine is famous all over. We ship the wines to New York and many other states. So that's a point right there that this is not just something that's locally done. The business was lucrative. In less than 3 years, by 1902, the Artemanis had paid off their entire 60-acre tract of land. But Bandini also stated that part of the reason why they're shipping their wine out is that they have to. That grapes are hard to sell locally and have to be made into wine. Remember, this is an era without refrigeration. And they can't sell their wines at home. Now, that last statement that he makes is not really clear because native wines were generally legal to sell in Arkansas. But he may have been concerned about a few arrests in Taneytown for selling fruit brandy, or grape jack as it's known locally, and probably also upset about some recent actions by the state legislature. In 1909, the General Assembly of the state of Arkansas, urged by Washington County politicians, whether out of anti-Catholic animus or targeting Taneytown and the wine industry isn't really sure, they passed an act that prohibited the sale or giving away or procuring for all intoxicating malt, vinous, ardent, or fermented liquors of any kind and their compounds, which are used and drank as a beverage, including native wine, within 5 miles of the Woodlawn Presbyterian Church in Washington County, Arkansas. So what they did is they created one of those halos of prohibition, a dry zone, around this Woodlawn Presbyterian Church. Now, I had never heard of this church, and I'm relatively familiar with the area around Taneytown. I don't think that it's a structure that's still standing. You can kind of, if you look at that plat map, you can kind of figure out where it is if you also go to Google Maps. But this was a little church that it seems like the politicians that are in favor of prohibition and against wine production in Taneytown, that they're going to use as a way to shut down the wine industry in Taneytown in 1909. So that church is located right here. And a 5-mile dry zone around this little church is pretty big compared to a lot of the other similar pieces of legislation. So that 5-mile zone, if you kind of map it out on Google Maps, that extends up all the way through Elm Springs and goes almost all the way to Springdale over here. So that's pretty significant, and it does absolutely shut everything down for wine production in Taneytown. According to court documents that Taneytown individuals filed against the law, That church at Woodlawn was barely a church. It held no more than 10 Sunday services a year. The community fought the legislation, not just in a lawsuit, but by trying to rally the state legislature to change the law, but to no avail. And so on May 20th, 1914, a month after he was reelected mayor of Taneytown, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Felix Artemani for illegally selling wine. Now, Artemani was certainly aware of the law he violated, and he did so decisively, selling 9 gallons of native wine to one J.C. Azell of Benton County. After being found guilty, Artemani immediately appealed the case to the state Supreme Court. His arrest may have been a deliberate move to create the legal grounds upon which to force the state Supreme Court to rule on the constitutionality of laws like Woodlawn. Many of those laws seem to conflict with that 1899 act that had gone out of its way to protect native wine. So it had also been interpreted as putting that type of spirit in a separate category. So what they wanted the courts to rule on was, could one targeted act, like the Woodlawn Act, negate the intent of that 1899 act that was supposed to protect from prohibition native wine production in Arkansas? Unfortunately, though, the ruling of the Arkansas Supreme Court was ruled largely moot, by the passage of the Newberry Act in 1915, and that was the act that made Arkansas dry for all intents and purposes. After January 1st, 1916, it was illegal to sell alcohol in Arkansas anyway. Luckily, the Taneytown community had been pragmatic enough to search out other ways of using those grapes. With the coming of Prohibition, one newspaper article noted, Taneytown producers had turned their attention to developing a sweeter grape for table use. So if you talk about a table grape, you're basically talking about a grape that is not going to be good for wine production, or as good for wine production. Many of the wine varieties, this article said, were worked over by grafting the Concord grape onto the old wine grape roots. This process is called top grafting, and it would have been beneficial because the vines would only lose 1 year of production. Newly planted vines would take 3 years to come into full production. At first, most of the new Concord grapes were shipped out of the area on the railroad to larger markets. But the most lucrative option for Taneytown would be to secure a processing plant in the immediate area affiliated with a large juice company. And that's where the Welches will come in. Now, the existence of such an economically viable alternative use for the vines during Prohibition was thanks to the innovations of, ironically, a teetotaler from New York. In 1869, Thomas Welch, applying Louis Pasteur's solution for removing wild yeast from grape juice, produced his first bottles of Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. He did this by bottling the juice and then subjecting the bottles to high heat, thereby killing out contaminating yeast. Now, Pasteur, when he did this, he wanted to kill out the wild yeast so that he could then reintroduce a certain kind of yeast that was going to produce a higher quality wine. But that wasn't Welch's goal at all. He just wanted the pasteurization to stop fermentation completely, and it did. Pasteurized grape juice was born. Welch's goal, however, was not to produce the juice for a wide market. As a prohibitionist, he simply wanted a non-alcoholic option for services in the Methodist Church. When the church refused to accept that Welch's non-alcoholic product was actually wine, which they viewed as a requirement for sacral use, he abandoned any further plans. His son, however, C.E. Welch, took up this cause and in 1882 created the company C.E. Welch & Co. In 1886, the company built its first factory. Shelf-stable, unfermented juice, however, was a new invention, and it had no established market. So for most people, they'd never heard of grape juice. This is before refrigeration. It's before there's ever been anyone else producing pasteurized grape juice. If you didn't pasteurize it, it would go bad or start to ferment. So there weren't a whole lot of people that would think of, I'd like to drink grape juice. And that's the biggest problem that Welch has at first, because he's trying to figure out how do I get people to buy this product. So in the early years, the main market for the juice did end up being a substitute for sacramental wine, in a typical late 19th century fashion, as a dubious cure for a wide array of medical conditions. But concurrent with the nation's steps toward prohibition in the early 20th century was the rise of the public profile of unfermented grape juice, as it became increasingly connected to prohibition. Though the Welches had utilized advertising from the beginning, it was the accidental publicity offered by two men in the Wilson administration that made grape juice a national phenomenon. William Jennings Bryan, Methodist minister and Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, before he even accepted that position from the president, had asked if he could break with tradition and refrain from serving alcoholic beverages to guests. On April 12, 1913, he made waves by serving only grape juice at a dinner honoring the visiting British ambassador. A year later, the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Davis, banned the use of any alcoholic beverages, even by officers, on any vessel. The political cartoons alone that either lauded or lampooned Bryan's grape juice diplomacy or Davis's grape juice navy were priceless advertising for the Welch's product. The portion of the population supporting prohibition was significant, and an endorsement of grape juice as an alternative by two such well-known public figures was persuasive. Demand for grape juice began to rise. As the nation demobilized after World War I, the quality of the grapes Ardemani and Taneytown growers had been shipping to the Northeast convinced the Welch Juice Company to explore opening a manufacturing plant in Arkansas, and they broke ground on that plant between Taneytown and Springdale in 1922. The entire region responded by expanding the cultivation of grapes to supply the plant. Between 1900 and 1910, Washington County had reached more than 50,000 vines. Most of that growth can be attributed to Taneytown. But by 1924, there were over 2.2 million grapevines under cultivation in the county. Credit was repeatedly given to Taneytown for pioneering the crop and proving that Concord grapes would produce in the region, but many non-Italians had also joined in growing grapes. Grape production by the Taneytown Italians transformed Northwest Arkansas in the 1920s. From its very origins, Taneytown had endured internal pressure and outside scrutiny to succeed. So this profile of the community as leaders in agriculture and leaders in economic change in Northwest Arkansas, and the status and the financial security that comes from that, must have felt like the culmination of a long fight. Austin Corbin's imported Italians had done just fine and were now becoming economic leaders in the region. But the path to success had also created some ingrained habits. Father Bandini had been a relentless booster for the community, constantly advertising its successes and minimizing its failures. Although he had passed away in early 1917, the lessons he had taught in boosterism and promotion lived on, perhaps most especially in Felix Ardemani. During the 1920s, he would craft an image of Taneytown as sober, wholesome purveyors of grape juice and humble farmers. Ardemani had been involved with grape and wine production from the start, and by the 1920s, he was widely viewed as an expert on the cultivation of grapes. The year after the community hosted the Fruit Growers Convention in 1921, nearly 1,000 people participating in a farmer's short course at the University of Arkansas visited the vineyards at Taneytown, and Ardemani remained a participant and speaker at the annual Arkansas Fruitmen meetings for years. When a late frost hit the region in 1923, Ardemani was consulted directly by the local newspaper, offering his expert advice on how to prune back the damaged vines. Between 1925 and 1927, Ardemani received coverage not only in places like Berryville in Arkansas, but in newspapers in Wagner and Sallisaw, Oklahoma, and Exeter, Missouri, often being invited to come and assess land for suitability for grape production. Ardemani maintained a streak of showmanship, however, and gained national attention for a stunt in connection with the annual Grape Festival in 1926. Refrigerator cars of grapes were sent to two female governors, President Calvin Coolidge and Italian Premier Benito Mussolini, the latter of which sent back a cablegram of congratulations for the annual festival. Throughout Prohibition, the Grape Festival grew from a small community gathering to a regional event that showcased grape cultivation in the Ozarks and offered wholesome and benignly Italian-flavored fun, food, and entertainment for the whole family. Now, do you really think that they quit growing or quit producing wine in Taneytown? Just like that? Oh, it's Prohibition. That's what's interesting about all this. You have all this glowing coverage of how wholesome Taneytown is, and Concord grapes are for grape juice. That it makes you kind of wonder, like, why was nobody questioning why all of a sudden the whole nation now wants to buy bottled grape juice, especially considering Pasteur came up with this method as a step in wine production, right? So you can take a bottle of pasteurized grape juice and you can still turn it into wine. But we pretend like that's not a thing, right? All the coverage for Taneytown in the 1920s talks about it's very wholesome, it's very sober. There's no hint that anything else is going on in Taneytown, which makes it a really, when you step back and think about it, like, do we think that's really what happened? So one of the things that I always thought was interesting was especially this whole thing about inviting Artemani to come and assess the land for grape production. Were they doing that just to, because they want to get in on the grape juice thing, or does it also matter that he had been the head of the Wine Growers Association as well? So, but throughout the 20s, the community does a really good job of presenting this very changed image. The wholesome fun of the annual Grape Festival contributed to that image of a community that had moved beyond its spiritist roots. And you see it also in other newspaper coverage. In 1923, for example, the Taneytown correspondent shared a lovely story with the Springdale News where an old-timer at Sil Cordiana and Mary Chola's wedding was heard to remark that since Volstead, which is the national legislation that made the country dry, since Volstead made his appearance on the stage a few years ago, the dinners are not what they used to be. And then the whole crowd at this wedding dinner joined in and answered in a sorrowful tone, "Them days are gone forever." Now, Sil Cordiana was known for making wine, grape jack, and beer. Here is a picture from his wedding day. They do look so sober, right? The idea that he had a dry wedding is kind of ridiculous. The reality was, of course, that alcohol production in Taneytown never stopped. I think Prohibition was a big deal for Taneytown, recalled Floyd Maestri, who was born the year Arkansas went dry. A lot of people sold wine and grape jack, which is distilled wine. Prohibition may have increased demand for the more potent grape jack. In most places, of course, the product that is produced from distilling wine is called brandy. Early official documents before Prohibition do make mention of brandy in relation to Taneytown, usually the illegal production thereof, but why the locals call it grape jack is a mystery. Distillation of wine, however, was not common in Italy, at least in the part where they originated, and they may have learned the practice in the U.S. Since the colony had also spent a few years producing apples, they may have learned the term grape jack from their neighbors, which is a commonly known term for apple brandy. So, logic might have dictated for Italians learning English that a similar product from grapes would be called grape jack. As for why one would distill wine, not all grapes are destined to become fine wine. Some may have damaged, been picked at the wrong time, or be mildewed. But they can still be fermented. Aware that the taste of such wine may be off anyway, additional sugar, if available, might be added to up the alcohol content. Once fermented, the wine was distilled to produce an alcohol of 150 to 160 proof. Dad, and in this case, this is Lillian Cordiana in an interview talking about her father Sil, Dad even had some once that was 190 proof. It was so strong it would burn your tongue, she said. They'd dilute it down with water to make it about 90 proof and then drink it and have a good time. My mother, and she's talking about Mary here, my mother always put grape jack in her coffee. She lived to be 90. Maestri remembered, when I was a kid, there was always a little still sitting on our kitchen stove. Another Taneytown resident born during Prohibition noted, when the feds got hot, they would carry the grape jack out into the woods and hide it. I know my dad had a 5-gallon crock. Maestri also remembered Prohibition agents. I've seen officers a couple of times, he recalled, but noted that usually the community was tipped off. There were instances, however, when officials caught their targets. The first was in 1916, right after Arkansas went dry, when Julia Pianalto, Felix Artemani's 20-year-old sister-in-law, was arrested for selling native wine. As her crime was still a state offense at that time, her penalty was only $50. In 1921, however, when deputies raided Pasquale Piazzola's farm and captured approximately 2,000 gallons of grape wine, he had committed a federal crime. 2 years later, another 250 gallons of wine and beer met their demise at the hands of federal agents, this time a Prohibition officer by the name of S.M. Gurley. Felix Artemani had been held in connection with that case, but for some unknown reason, he was dismissed. 5 years later, in 1929, Officer Gurley again connected with the Artemanis, this time raiding Felix's brother Pete's house in Fort Smith. He had a vineyard there and 502 gallons of wine in his house and a small shed out back. Pete appears to have continued to run the family's illicit booze arm, while Felix kept up the clean public face. Pete's wine had originated in Taneytown and took 3 trips in a large truck to be transported to the federal building. Artemani, Gurley declared, took his arrest good-naturedly. The two were probably already acquainted. All in all, busts of Taneytown alcohol producers were probably pretty rare, considering the likely number of people producing or imbibing the craft. The people of Taneytown were becoming a part of the local fabric of the region, although perhaps not exactly the kind of assimilation Peter Bandini had envisioned. Not only did the individuals purchasing the products produced in Taneytown have an incentive to protect their source, but as Floyd Maestri suggested, local law enforcement was probably aiding and tipping off the community. Taneytown may also have been more connected to other communities running illicit booze than is generally remembered. In 1918, for example, Julia Pianalto, who had been arrested for selling wine in 1916, married a man named John Riley Coffey from Fort Smith, and he had been busted for distributing whiskey in 1915. One can only speculate on exactly how they met. In 1929, Evangeline Verrucchi married into the Baker family of Madison County, a clan also rumored to pursue lucrative industries of dubious legality. Assimilation and intermarriage with locals may have bestowed unexpected benefits. At the very least, shared knowledge and understanding of laws and the legal process was a way that those connections had helped the Italians. Not everyone, however, was happy to interact with the Italians on such a friendly basis. In the summer of 1923, a small group of masked men made repeated attempts to break into the house and cellar of Santo Chola, once involving a shootout with his son Victor, known in Taneytown as High due to his penchant for wearing trousers that were not long enough. Newspaper coverage studiously avoided mentioning exactly why anyone would be interested in breaking into the cellar of Santo and High Chola in the dead of night. But for all their protestations of unfair attack, it is likely, of course, that the Cholas were making wine. And indeed, in 1931, High Chola and Joe and Tony Costa were busted for selling wine, beer, and brandy. Both the Great Depression and the end of Prohibition would change the nature of grape production in Taneytown once again. It does not appear that Taneytown reduced the acreage of vineyards in the Depression of the 1930s, but the boom years of rapidly increasing production ended in the 1920s. With the end of national prohibition in 1933, some speculated on the return of winemaking in the community. If Arkansas should repeal its state dry laws, which was in no way guaranteed, a Missouri paper considered, the Italian community of Taneytown could be depended upon to develop a sizable winemaking industry. A good many of the Cynthiana grapes are still in good condition. But Prohibition had changed taste among Americans, who now preferred stronger and sweeter spirits. The winemaking of the post-Prohibition era would be another transformation of Taneytown and the grape culture of the region. If good company, good wine, good welcome can make good people, the Italians of Taneytown provided the first two and delivered the last despite a hostile welcome. From the early years of trial and error with grape varieties in the climate of their new home to the disappointing loss of their budding wine industry due to Prohibition, the community displayed ingenuity and resilience. The blow did not destroy Taneytown. In adapting once again to a new situation, seeking out commercial opportunities, and bringing their entire region into a new and lucrative agricultural endeavor during Prohibition, the Italians of Taneytown made good on the dreams of their founders and proved many a naysayer wrong. So I hope you have enjoyed this look at the early years of Taneytown and wine production in the area. I hope that next time you go out to the Grape Festival or to the winery in Taneytown, you think back on this history and understand the roots of what you're getting to experience in this unique part of the town. Thank you so much to the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History for having me. I'm always delighted to spend time with you, even if it's virtually. And thank you so much. Have a great evening.